So now for the next part of our program, we are going to hear from a minister who was here in this church, who was part of the Clergy Consultation Service. Reverend Richard S. Gilbert is Minister Emeritus of the First Unitarian Church of Rochester after having served there for 32 years. He was a Unitarian minister for 44 years. He served this church, First Unitarian Society of Ithaca, from 1965 to 1970 before going to Rochester, and then returned as interim minister from 2003 to 2005. In 1995, he received a Holmes Weatherby Award of the Unitarian Universalist Association for faith-based social justice work. He has written several books, one on the connection between spirituality and social action. He is working on a book about this topic. I first learned of Dick Gilbert's work with the Clergy Consultation Service at a UUA webinar about the history of the CCS last spring. I was shocked when they introduced Dick Gilbert to tell about his work when he was minister of this church, our church. I have to confess that tears were running down my face as I realized that he and David Evans and many more did this work at great possible personal risk for those of us who might have sought out abortions then. They did this work for us. I am so grateful. Dick.
I'm grateful to the readers who have brought this story so dramatically to you. And I was a part of it, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. But first, I'd like to quote from the poet E.E. Cummings. He concludes his poem, "Pity this busy monster, man unkind," in these words: "We doctors know a hopeless case if, listen, there's a hell of a good universe next door. Let's go." Well, if you know of a hell of a good universe next door, please do let me know. However, unless you have a Harry Potter diploma in the world of wizardry, we are pretty much stuck in this one. One immediate obstacle, of course, as you've heard, is the decision of the United States Supreme Court and Dobbs decision repealing Roe v. Wade. And even now, in the tragic aftermath of that decision, we have a new case before the Supreme Court, SCOTUS as we call them, FDA versus Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. That is considering regulating the use of mifepristone. Let me try that one again. Mifepristone as an abortion. More than half of all abortions now are medically induced in this way. I'll say more about that. But the possibility of Margaret Atwood's dystopian Handmaid's Tale is really a very chilling thought. I have a particular and even passionate interest in this topic, not only because I believe in a woman's agency, moral agency, but because I have tried to defend reproductive justice for quite a long time. I use that term to include freedom of choice, equity of access, and community of support. And so my question is, are we morphing from the bad old days to the bad new days? This is my story. The phone rang in my office, right, very close to here, one day in the winter of 1969. My First Baptist Church friend and colleague, Dave Evans, was on the line. He wanted to talk about the role of clergy in helping women who sought abortions. It was difficult to get an abortion in 1969, as it is now in many places in our land. Abortion was essentially illegal in New York State in those days. Problem pregnancies were rampant. The rich could access them, the poor could not. In May of 1967, the Reverend Howard Moody of Judson Memorial Church in New York City, as you have heard, formed the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. Dave asked if I would be interested in forming a similar group here in Ithaca. I was. Moody came to Ithaca. We met with OB/GYN doctors. We met with psychiatrists. We had theological and ethical discussions. We met with a Cornell Law School professor, Harrop Freeman. Any of you remember Harrop Freeman? Yes. Or am I too old? You do good. There's at least the two of us. Because we wanted to ascertain what were our legal obligations in this matter. What were the dangers? After all, what we proposed to do was in a very legally gray area, almost akin to civil disobedience, and we knew it. We secured the permission of our church boards, of course, as good clergy would. An answering service, you've heard about this, a answering service was set up. We were on call for a week at a time. Women came from all over the state. We even had referrals from liberal nuns and priests at Cornell. The goal of our upstate clergy counseling service on problem pregnancies was twofold. One, to provide all options counseling, and two, to repeal New York State's restrictive abortion law. The group developed a counseling discipline not only to provide consultation, but also to maximize our legal protection, should that become necessary. We counseled only in our church offices. We required a note from a doctor indicating that the woman was pregnant and how far along she was. In each case, we explored with the woman the options open to her, bringing the pregnancy to term, and then keeping the child or placing it for adoption, or abortion. If she was accompanied by her partner, we were sensitive to the pressure that he might bring to bear upon her. And so we made it a point to always find time to counsel with a woman alone. To be sure, this was her decision. CCS provided us a counseling form to be used with each woman. 1, my reasons for wanting an abortion at this time. 2, my reasons for or against parental or other family involvement in this decision. 3, the involvement and decision of the other person in this matter. And 4, my experience with and feelings about contraception. In every case, we tried to determine if the woman might qualify for a legal therapeutic abortion in New York State. But that was only, as you've heard, only if the life of the woman were threatened. And that had to be certified by 2 doctors. Thanks to Moody's New York group and his assistant, Arlene Carmen, along with many others, we had a list of safe and legal alternatives. With them, we had created a kind of underground network. We would not refer women for non-hospital abortions after 12 weeks. We used only physicians licensed in the state where they were practicing. All our referrals were out of state, where abortion was either legal or less restrictive than in New York. We went over the list of doctors for the women, their requirements, and of course, their fees, and you heard something about that. Some of the women were poor, but financial aid was limited. Arrangements were to be made by the woman herself with a doctor, and upon her return, we advised a physical examination by her own physician and discussion of use of contraceptives and their use to prevent further unwanted pregnancies. We asked that they report something of their experience to us. Some did, many did not. We launched publicly, as you've heard, in the Ithaca Journal in March of 1969. Our caseload grew quickly. By February 1970, we were seeing 90 women per week. Over the year, I counseled over 50 women, but I will never forget one week when I met with 17. The women who appeared in my office were a microcosm of the social problems of the nation. A teenage girl whose Catholic parents would never give permission. A financially challenged married couple in their 40s who already had 6 children. 2 pre-med students for whom a child would have jeopardized their medical careers. And most dramatically, a Native American woman who threatened suicide as she rushed out of my office. And so the decision was a tough one in every case. None of these women took the matter casually. The women had abortions, as you've heard, in England, Puerto Rico, Japan, Maryland, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, among other places. There were 2 legal New York State abortions out of 6 attempted. One woman we referred, as you've already heard, died. From the beginning, we combined counseling with legislative advocacy. Our Republican Assemblywoman, Connie Cook, introduced a bill to repeal New York's restrictive law. Nelson Rockefeller was our Republican governor. The Assembly was run by Republicans. The Senate was run by Republicans. My, how the times have changed. The debate on the Assembly floor was bitter and the vote was close. The bill passed when Auburn's Democratic Assembly member George Michaels, whose son I knew as a student activist at Cornell, up at the God Box, Annabelle Taylor Hall, CURW, when he changed his vote at the last minute and cast a deciding vote, decriminalizing abortion as of July 1st, 1970. In the next election, he was swept from office. And to this day, I regret not having gotten myself involved in his campaign. Let that be a lesson to us. Both these legislators in my book were profiles in courage, one Republican, one Democrat. It had been heartbreaking to work with these women, with desperate women who were forced to sneak about like common criminals to exercise their right to control their own bodies. And so with a great sense of relief, we disbanded in June of 1970, thinking, foolishly, that our work was done. Our relief turned to hope when the U.S. Supreme Court in 1973 passed Roe v. Wade, decided Roe v. Wade. I engaged with other issues. There were plenty of them out there. Obviously, I took my victory lap a little prematurely. After moving to Rochester in 1970, I joined a citizens review panel for research in mifepristone and misoprostol trial, known commonly as the abortion bill RU 486. This procedure, or something like it, is now utilized in over half the abortions in the U.S., and that number is likely to grow, depending on what our illustrious Supreme Court decides in the next few weeks. Our local religious coalition for reproductive choice met with the University of Rochester pre-med students and had ethical discussions with the OB/GYN staff at the hospital, one of the local hospitals. I debated abortion with a pro-life couple, armed with the infamous slides of discarded fetuses. I vividly recall another debate on abortion with an inner-city doctor whose work I had admired. In the course of our discussion, he was asked by one of the members of the audience what he would do if his 13-year-old daughter, who was sitting in the room, had been raped and became pregnant. When he said he would insist that she carry the pregnancy to term, I knew I had more work to do. At one public demonstration, a young anti-abortion woman, discovering I was a minister, shouted at me, "Preacher, you're going to hell." Happily, as a born universalist, I don't believe in hell. So it didn't bother me. And I received some nasty mail, but no death threats yet. Our group had a much better interaction with the anti-abortion Christians for Life through a Quaker-led Claremont Circle process, which helped me to understand the basic humanity of anti-abortion people. It was an amazing process, and maybe somebody would like to ask about it later. But we did not change any minds, but we changed hearts to at least respect one another. As a universalist, what else could I do? With an anti-abortion friend who marched with me against the war in Vietnam and for the war on poverty, I served on an ecumenical commission of the Rochester Community of Churches. We were charged with seeking a consensus on abortion. We failed. A champion of the so-called consistent life ethic, my friend was the founder of the Susan B. Anthony List, an anti-abortion group, even though we have no evidence that Anthony opposed abortion. I'm writing a book on Susan B. Anthony, and that is one of my sections. But my friend wrote to me in these words, "Dear Dick, thanks for the consistent life ethics considered and critiqued. It is very well done, thorough and intelligent." She went on to point out what she thought were my mistakes, saying that she would file my paper away, as she did everything that I wrote and others have written. She concluded, "Thanks for the challenge we seek to seek the truth ever more completely and profoundly, Carol." We have not connected too much lately, but I think this exemplifies the need to disagree agreeably. Fast forward to 2019, when I chaired Interfaith Impact of New York State, and we successfully, along with many other groups, perhaps many of you, with the Reproductive Choice Health Act and the Comprehensive Contraceptive Coverage Act. ROE in New York State is now embedded not in the criminal code, but in the health code where it belongs. Abortions are permitted in the first 24 weeks of pregnancy, when all but 1% of abortions take place, and third trimester exceptions for fetal non-viability or to protect life or health of the woman. Contraceptives are more generally available in New York State. In New York, a woman's moral agency is respected. The Equal Rights Amendment on November's ballot would embed reproductive justice, among other rights, in the state constitution. However, and sadly, a Rochester judge has ruled it must be taken off the ballot for procedural reasons. It is now in litigation. Keep watching the paper. Well, that's my story, but how did I feel about it? Why did I say yes to David? I was 33, and this was my first solo congregation. Some of you may remember it. Very solo. I was previously an assistant minister and a graduate student. I had relatively little experience in counseling with women with problem pregnancies. I did believe in human freedom, human autonomy, reproductive justice, and David was very effective as a gentle persuader. Those of you who know him know this. Still, it was an extremely wrought issue. One of my colleagues, Unitarian Universalist colleagues in Detroit, had been arrested for doing this, though he was not convicted. I suppose I was a bit apprehensive about my legal jeopardy, but I had board and congregational support. The counseling itself was very moving. Here I was, one who faced most ethical issues with typical Unitarian Universalist reason, helicoptering 10,000 feet above the issue in wonderful abstractions which we could put together so easily. But here were women, real live women with real live problems. This experience did, however, help me to develop a greater sense of empathy, compassion, and most of all, humility. It was painful to know that we could not offer much help besides one counseling session. These women were the ones who bore the real burdens. As I indicated, once New York's abortion reform law was passed, I heaved a sigh of relief, naively thinking the struggle was over. I have learned that on such emotionally charged issues, there is seldom a definitive resolution, only a constant struggle. And if you remember no other of my remarks, seldom is there a definitive resolution on such issues, only a constant struggle. Now looking back on what we did and looking over the social, political, and moral landscape, I conclude that in the words of my friend and colleague, the Reverend Tom Davis, in the book of the same title, I was engaged in what he called sacred work. It was sacred because it affirmed human autonomy. It was sacred because it furthered human health. It was sacred because it represented the courage of troubled women. They are the heroes and heroines of this story. It was sacred work because I was supported by my religious convictions and by my denominations, which passed its first resolution supporting abortion rights in 1963, and several times since. It was sacred work because of the history of that movement and the cause of women's rights, from Susan B. Anthony to the present. It is sacred work because it is not floating in a helicopter 10,000 feet high, but because it emerges out of fundamental human experience. New York was the site of the first Women's Rights Convention, 1848. Now it is high time that New York once more take the lead in guaranteeing this fundamental justice for women. I see several immediate things that we ought to be doing, I'm afraid. One, continue to make the moral, social, and political case for reproductive justice in its broadest sense. Repeal of Roe v. Wade has opened a new dimensions of reproduction that include, but are not limited to abortion, but miscarriage, and as we discovered more recently, in vitro fertilization. Abortion is health care, plain and simple. We can do this work through stories which may not create the truth, but they do illustrate the truth. Two, pass comprehensive sexuality education in New York State. Yes. So ignorance will not be so likely to lead more women into difficult dilemmas in reproduction. I see I have some supporters out there. Good. But our state legislature is very slow, folks, very slow. Three, become a safe haven for women from other states who cannot get or afford abortions. And four, be part of the so-called pill underground and telemedicine efforts to make access more equitable. And five, to advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, assuming it gets on the ballot, as I hope it will, this November, so that reproductive justice and many other rights will be enshrined in New York State's Constitution. Dr. David Reese Williams, one of my predecessors at the Rochester Unitarian Church, was an advocate for family planning who served on the executive committee of the local Birth Control League, the predecessor of Planned Parenthood. He did this despite the abhorrent and stifling 1870 Comstock laws, of which we've heard a great deal lately. When the controversial Margaret Sanger, a national leader in family planning, spoke at Rochester's Temple Beth Kodesh in 1932, she was arrested for answering a question about where birth control devices could be obtained. Williams then preached a sermon on the spiritual significance of voluntary motherhood and invited Sanger to speak from the pulpit of the First Unitarian Church subsequently. A group of 8 women from First Unitarian formed an organization that eventually became Planned Parenthood of Rochester and now Syracuse as well. When the organization found it difficult to obtain office space elsewhere, First Unitarian provided them space in the Gannett House from 1934 to 1937. This was sacred work. David Evans did sacred work here in New York State, here in this community. OBGYN Dr. Alan Brad did it by openly admitting he had performed an abortion in violation of the outrageous Texas law. He was sued, just what he wanted, but the case was dismissed. David is no longer among us. Dr. Braid is 76, but he isn't finished with his work, nor am I at 87. More important, neither are we. The hell of a good universe to which E.E. Cummings referred is not next door. It is here and now, but only if we create it. We must not go back to the bad old days before 1970 and 1973. We have learned that victory in struggle can lead to apathy. Defeat can lead to mobilization. Defending reproductive justice is sacred work, which taps our most important beliefs, our most basic beliefs, and tests our deepest faith commitments. I am proud to do it, and I hope you are too.